I'll start with myself. I'm Mike. I'm CPO at Small PDF, although this title is kind of weird because we have one big organization of product engineering, design, and data that is all together. It's just, I guess there will be too many letters after C to make it work, so we started with product. Before that, I was at a company called Typeform. By the way, who knows what Small PDF does? Just out of curiosity, who have heard of Small PDF? Okay. Who has used Typeform before? All right, there are some people who use Typeform, nice. So I was COO at Typeform prior to joining Small PDF. And before that, I was at a company called Leanplum, which mostly does analytic, marketing automations, and then Vango and NativeX, two companies in mobile advertising technology. If you are playing mobile games and you've ever watched an ad to get an extra life, then that's my fault. I take the blame for that. Actually, Vango was the company that invented the concept of actually giving you a life for watching a video ad. So I feel like I've ruined some lives, but that's okay. Developers were grateful for that. And I started at Nokia. So I've worked with most of the aspects of the organization in my life. The two departments I've never worked for are actually HR. So I'm not sure how much I can help there. And operations, finance, but otherwise, from sales to engineering, I was doing it at some point in my life. So happy to discuss that. For those who don't know anything about Small PDF, the company was founded in 2013, headquartered in Zurich. We have an office in Belgrade, which is just a little bit bigger than your startup. I think we are now 18, maybe, roughly around that. Planning to be 50 by mid-next year. We'll see how that works. And we're also opening an office in Barcelona, hopefully before the end of the year. So the company is growing. We are 95 employees. I feel like we should be already 200. I think everyone has the same problem. You can't hire people fast enough. But as a company, I think we are kind of in this unique situation where the company has grown much faster than the headcount. So unfortunately, we have people doing a lot of different roles as a result. A little bit about it. The vision, make document work effortless. So most of our customers are small and medium businesses that still deal with a lot of paperwork, from invoicing to contracts, and essentially we were trying to help them make that easy and simple by offering them a bunch of different tools. So in terms of numbers, officially we crossed 1 billion users, I think 2 months ago. It was something like that, so I think September, when we crossed 1 billion users. We have about 45 million monthly active users, which I think places us among the top 100 websites in the world, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. But then really a lot of people need to do things with PDFs. And we have about 300,000 paying customers, most of them Europe, North America, slowly growing in Asia as well, and Latin America. And a little bit about what we're going to talk today. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is a little bit about the key sort of ideas that at least I consider important when you're thinking about designing organization, when you're thinking about scaling a startup, when you're crossing different sort of stages in the development. Then I wanted to share some of the learnings I had over my career. So I had this opportunity a few years ago to go on a tour around the world and meet with some of the board members at Amazon, at TransferWise, Spotify, Valve, Supercell. Essentially, we were in this very lucky situation where our engineering organization completely imploded because it didn't scale well. But we had a very, very nice investor, Kleiner Perkins, and they said, okay, you clearly don't know how to scale it, so we'll invite you to talk to people who do know, go and visit them, and they will tell you what works for them. And maybe from that you can learn something and change your own organization. So I wanted to share some of the learnings from that time, and then a little bit about how those learning evolved into what we have right now at Small PDF and how it works. And if you're, by the way, interested if it works at all, there are also people over here who work in this organization other than me. And we have one rule, which is managers have limited influence on promotions. The reason for that is we want people to be very open and transparent and not be afraid to criticize their managers and tell me when I'm telling bullshit. So you can ask them and they can confirm whether actually this works or not for them, which hopefully will be the testament to the truth or not truth in this. So let's see. 5:53, I'll slowly kick it off. So I would say, before I jump into this, for those of you who don't know Typeform, I will share a quick story from Typeform. If you don't know Typeform, Typeform is about 350, 400 people right now, roughly $1 billion valuation. Headquartered in Barcelona, offices now in 6 different countries. And essentially what Typeform does is online surveys, forms for collecting data and stuff like that. And when I joined Typeform, it was a very strange moment because the company decided to replace the entire leadership team. And I've actually never seen anything like that. New CEO, new CFO, new COO, new CPO, new CTO, who've never worked with each other and never met before, which is probably the strangest thing that I would never recommend you to do. It's a really terrible idea to start building a team while being a leadership team of, back then, 250 people organization. But the reason for that was Typeform was founded by 2 designers who are absolutely brilliant product designers, but who absolutely hate leading and managing people. And at some point of time, they fell in love with a company called Valve. Does anyone heard over here of Valve? Who plays games? Okay, so those who play games, who are Valve. Well, Valve is a multi-billion-dollar company. I think the last time I checked, they were making about $8 billion. But they are essentially the app stores for games on the PC and on Mac, plus they make their own games. But what's crazy about Valve is there's no CEO, there's no CFO, there's no management. Everyone is equal, and the entire organization is flat. And you can do whatever you want, theoretically. I actually went to see if that's true, so I'll tell you a little bit more about this, but the founders of Typeform thought, okay, this is such a brilliant idea, right? We will empower everyone in the company, and they will do whatever they want, and they will want to build amazing company, so we'll have an amazing company. And what happened is people in Barcelona actually preferred to go to the beach on Friday than build a company. And on Wednesday, they preferred to run errands than come to the company and work. So there were expectations of management. Everyone will go here, and some people went here, but majority of people went in a different direction. And the board decided that this is really not going well, and that's why there was this entire change of the leadership team and management. And that brings me to the point, one size does not fit all. You can always go on the internet, you can always read about the cool company, they will have very cool ideas. 99% of the time, they will not work for you. So why? Well, because first of all, well, you're not Amazon, right? You're not Google. We recently hired a new technical product manager from Google, and he's coming and he's saying, well, you should have site reliability engineers in your company. For those of you who don't know, site reliability engineers are the reason why Google search never goes down, even if every other website in the world goes down. This is essentially the team that is responsible for making sure that they function 24/7. Any disaster, any potential problem, they will make it work. Now, it took them 10 years to develop code to the quality where that is actually possible. We're not even 10 years old. They actually had already a 10-year-old code they were improving, and after 20 years, they reached a level where they could actually run it that way. So you come from Google, you think, well, that's going to work for you. No, it's not, because we are not there. We also have different people, different goals. Well, our product doesn't have to work 24/7 up to every second. We also don't have the same scale. We have a different business model. And all of those things require you to think differently. So you can take idea And then you have to ask yourself, well, will it work for me? Will it work for me now? Will it work for me a year from now, maybe 3 years from now? And really think about how you're going to evolve. The second thing is the trade-offs. There are a few very common trade-offs when you're designing an organization. The first one is efficiency versus velocity or responsiveness, right? A good example would be you're designing an efficient organization. You're going to put all the people that do the same job together, and maybe when you need a front-end engineer, you're going to call that front-end engineer. He's going to come in, do his work, then disappear, go somewhere else and do the work. They will be occupied 100% of the time. It's going to be very efficient. Except that them jumping between different teams is going to make it very hard for you to move fast. It's also going to make it very hard for you to respond to something that changes and requires you to suddenly make a change in direction. Second great example. We have a very close relationship with a company called TaxFix. Not sure if any of you heard, but TaxFix is another unicorn from Germany. Essentially, they do what the name says they do, which is they help you fill your taxes. And they are one of the many companies that went through the same problem, which is you grow very, very fast because your company grows very, very fast. But when you grow very, very fast, you cannot be really selective in terms of who you hire, because then you're not going to grow very, very fast. Right? If you're only hiring 1 out of 100 people that you're interviewing, you're going to grow very, very slow. If you're going to hire 30 out of 50 people you're interviewing, you're going to grow very, very fast. But then at some point of time, you're going to realize that a lot of these people don't work for you well. They're not cultural fits. They don't have the right skills. Then you have to go through the painful moment of saying to some of these people, goodbye. And that's the other problem, that if you think about fast growth, you're going to hire people who are probably less experienced, because it's much easier to hire an engineer fresh out of university than an engineer with 15 years of experience. You're probably going to hire a lot of people who are junior across every possible role. And then what needs to happen? You need to hire a manager who's going to tell them what to do, because they just came fresh out of university. They don't know what to do. And probably that manager is not also very experienced, because you're hiring very fast. So then you have to hire a manager who needs to tell the manager what they need to do. And very quickly you have this very hierarchical organization with 3 or 4 levels, and a lot of bureaucracy, and a lot of processes, and a lot of rules. On the other hand, you have what Netflix calls talent density. And they essentially say, if you hire a lot of experienced and smart people, you don't need any processes and any rules. Just let them do what they think they should be doing, because they probably know better. They're closer to the problem, and your processes might actually impede their growth. But again, depending on your people, you have to go one way or the other in terms of the choices. And finally, speed of decision making. There is an interesting model that comes from Amazon. I'll talk a little bit more about this. But essentially in Amazon, every team has one decision maker. So there might be 8 people on the team, 1 person decides what you need to do. In theory, it works great. As one member of the board at Amazon said, it's great for accountability. There's only one throat to choke when something goes wrong. Painful metaphor, but it's actually true. There's only one person who is to blame when something goes wrong. And when it comes to Amazon, that works well. Well, how complicated is Amazon's business model? Sell a lot of product at the cheapest price possible with the highest variety and deliver it fast. Everyone can get it. Everyone can make a decision whether what I'm building actually helps me achieve this or not. And then you're going to Facebook. And you're thinking about the new product. And you're thinking about all the mess they're in. You're thinking, okay, there's this VR, AR thing that is happening, and there's the problem with privacy, and we've really used to have a lot of games, now we don't have a lot of games, what should we invest? It's actually a difficult choice. And most likely, 70% of your choices will be wrong. So do you really want one person to make every single decision? Or would you rather have the product manager and the engineering manager and the UX designer spend some time discussing, figuring things out? So they maybe will make a better decision as a result, less mistakes, but sometimes they are stuck and it can take them 3 or 4 weeks to decide on something, and the team is not really progressing. And these are the choices you have to make. And you only know what business model you have, what situation you're in, so you can only figure out what actually applies to you the best. The other thing is this. So this comes from a famous Berkeley article, which goes back, I think, 18 years, which talks essentially about the dimension for startups, or what are the different things that you can change in a startup, and how does it change your model and the likelihood of being successful. And they essentially said there are 3 types of dimension. The first one is the rules for attachment and retention. More or less why people come in and why they stay with you, right? There are 3 simple things. They said, okay, the first one is people come to you for money. Or in some cases, benefits, right? I want to only work remotely, only Monday to Wednesday, and only about those hours. There's probably a company in the world that will allow me to do that. The second one is the quality of work. This is what Google is famous for. I go there because I can work on a self-driving car. And I could work there on a self-driving car 3 years before any other self-driving car company existed in the world. Well, I don't get opportunity to do that anywhere else, so I really want to go for that reason. The money is secondary. Of course, Google pays well. But it's really the growth opportunity, the excitement about work. And then the third one is, well, I go to work because I really like the people who I work with. This is the model of, we are a family, we are a community, we spend time together, we travel together, we get to know each other, so people don't want to leave because they have a lot of friends. Then there is a second one, which is how does the company choose the people to come in? The first one is, well, it's very simple. I have this job. I need someone who has the right skills to come and day one be successful in this job. Second one is, well, this person looks very smart. They might not be able to do this job right now, but a year from now they will be able to do twice as much, so I'll focus more on the potential. And then the third one is, well, we really like this person. They're going to be great for our cultural fit. Everyone's going to like them. They're going to be a great teammate, and we can work well together. And if you're thinking, well, we are recruiting for all 3, I can bet you don't. Because a good example would be a company that actually recruits for culture. Out of 5 interviews, will have 3 to 4 interviews dedicated to culture. And there will be almost no testing for skills. Good example is actually Valve. Valve almost never tests for skills. If you come to design games, they will ask you to do a task of a bookkeeper, because they're curious how you're going to think about the problem you've never solved before, but they are not really testing whether you know how to design games, because they know if you come over there, you might change your role or you move somewhere else, so it becomes secondary. And then the final thing is how you actually control and coordinate, right? So the first one is, well, founders tell me what to do. That I would say is 99.9% of startups of 10 people. I'm actually curious if the startup of 10 people, well, he's busy with the phone, I'll ask him later, whether that startup actually works that way. But it is very common, and I've been in these startups, even like 50, 60 people, when the founder says, well, I know I founded this company, I know what I'm building, I know for whom, I don't need your opinion. I need you to help me run my ideas because I know better. Then there's the second one, which is you come and you actually work well, you're coordinated, because everyone else has the same cultural norms, the same peer pressure. Essentially, you've built a culture where work ethic, where doing something for the company is great. The third one, you rely on professional standards. This is actually very common. Oracle, as one of the companies, used to have this norm that they only hire from Ivy League and public Ivy League colleges in America. That means 13 universities out of, I think, 5,500 that exist in America. If you went to any other university, they would simply throw away your resume when you sent there. It just didn't matter to them because there was a signal. You got to one of the best 13 colleges in America. That means you work hard, so then we don't need to check whether you're going to work hard with us because you've already proven for the previous 10 years in your life that you're willing to work hard and you have a really high work ethic. And then, of course, the last one is you build formal processes, procedures, reviews, and so on, and you use that for control. And where it takes you is actually takes you to 5 models for companies. Of course, there are different combinations that fall outside of this. Generally, they are not advised because usually that means you have elements that are incompatible with each other. But you have 5 models essentially for how companies exist. There's the star model, because you attract a lot of stars. That essentially people come for work, they're selected for potential, and they work because they are professionals, they have this high work ethic. Used to be called an engineering team model, now it's often referred to as a sports team model. I think everyone knows the sports team model. You come, you play, if you don't play well, you get transferred or you get released. There are no sentiments around this. This is not a family. If you're the third striker, most likely we're going to sell you or you're going to play in our B team. You come for work. You essentially are selected for your skills. You're a great striker. And then you stay because your colleagues, you work hard because your colleagues work hard, and essentially there's a peer pressure to deliver. The third model, called the family model, well, you stay because you love your colleagues. I've been in a company like that where it was Limplam. I think the churn, we had an office of 50 engineers in Bulgaria, and not a single person left this office for 2 years. And this is where Uber came to Bulgaria, VMware came to Bulgaria, all those big engineering companies were coming in and no one was leaving. I was curious why they are not leaving. Well, you know, it's like everyone over here is my family. We come, we play ping pong, we drink beer, we play pool, we meet at the weekends, we go to each other's weddings. If I leave, I'll leave all of my friends. So I want to be here. You know, you're selected for whether you actually fit with the group. And again, the group tells you whether you should be working more or not. Fourth model, bureaucracy, which is generally 90% of companies that are over 1,000 people, come for work, selected for skills, and then there's a formal process that tells you what to do, when to do, how to do it, and you're reviewed at the end, and you stay or go based on that. And finally, direct control. I would say this is mostly family-run companies right now. But essentially, this is where you have a founder who is the king, makes every decision. If you don't like it, you still stay because probably they will pay you well, and you're selected for your skills. So before I go to the next thing, I have to say my favorite book is Dune. I haven't seen the movie. I don't know if that quote is in the movie. I'll watch it in the future. But the one learning I've learned about scaling startups that I wanted to bring over here is this one. Give as few orders as possible. Once you've given order on the subject, you must always give orders on the subject. It's an interesting quote if you think about it, because our natural thing when we are scaling a company is to tell people what to do. And if we tell people what to do, they get used to being told what to do. Then you hire 5 other people, and you have to tell 5 people what to do. Then you hire 20 people, you have to tell 20 people what to do. So then you have to hire 5 people who will tell those 20 people what to do, and you will tell the 5 people, and that's how bureaucracies are being made. So if you want to avoid this kind of situation, on day 1, you have to find a way for people to figure out what to do without you having to tell them all the time. So quickly about the models, by the way, I think we can make this presentation available through ICT Hub. So if you want the slides, I'll make them available. I'll skip this because I already discussed those models and start going into the next thing. So we have a few engineers. Who is familiar with the Conway Law? All right, 4 hands up. So you can now doze off for the next 5 minutes and I'll quickly explain this whole idea. So if you have a bunch of engineering teams, essentially, very simple ideas, they will not want to talk to other engineering teams because it takes a lot of time. So over time, they will start building walls around their software so they don't have to talk to other teams, and they will try to figure out how to get their software together so it's only accessible to them, and someone else will build their own software, and essentially the software will become more and more modular around the teams that you have. So generally, modularity is very good in software, but obviously, in the traditional software development, there was a person called architect. They will come in, they will design some beautiful architecture, then they will say, you're going to build this component, you're going to build this component, you're going to build this component. And every single time they did that, they failed. Because the teams didn't want to build components that will be used by someone else. They started introducing their own patterns because this was their code, their software that they had to use. So essentially, what they've learned from this is, if you have an idea for software architecture, you should organize your team how you think your software architecture should look like, because the teams will copy your organization to avoid, of course, having to talk to too many people that they don't want to talk. So this is essentially one of the biggest laws in engineering that really disappeared for, I think, 40 years, because it was invented in the 70s, then forgotten for about 30 years. And roughly in 2012, I think someone actually came up with the idea of inverting it and saying, hey, if architecture of the company always follows the organization, maybe we should start designing organization the way we want to look the architecture of the company to look like, so we will avoid this problem. So, big learning. If you're organizing your team, you have to figure out where you want to go in terms of the organization for the software. Otherwise, you might end up in a place where you don't want to be. Second thing is cognitive load. Cognitive load is essentially how much stuff you can hold in your memory. By the way, do you know how much stuff you can hold in your memory? Short-term memory? In general, in short-term memory, how many different facts can you store in short-term memory?
Depends on what you can automate in the forensic scheme, and as well in the virtual spatial memory parts.
Okay, how many separate numbers without chunking can you hold in your memory at any point in time?
It used to be 7 plus minus 2, now it's something like 4.
Perfect.
Different research.
Perfect, that's exactly the number. So what we mostly do is, if we try to remember a number, let's say a 9-number telephone number, we're not going to remember 9 separate digits, we're going to chunk, so we're going to remember 919 instead of 919. And that means we can remember roughly 3 to 4 numbers like that together. So if you're good at chunking, maybe you can remember easily 11, 12 digits. Without chunking, you're going to remember roughly 4 to 5 numbers. Now, when you're an engineer, it has also an application, although, sorry, what's your name? Alex. Has a very good point. Depending on the type of information stored differently, we can remember a little bit more or a little bit less. But the point is, you'll have to remember a lot of different things. You've built some software, you're going to have to remember how it functions, what happens when it breaks, how do you going to change it. You also have to remember how you deploy software, how you test software. There's a lot of processes, a lot of procedures. And when you have a team that has to do all of that by themselves, they're going to very often have to move from one task to another and figure out essentially how to switch. And when they switch, they'll have to remember something that they just forgotten. And that makes the work very slow. And also generally stressful, because you're always constantly doing something and it feels like you should remember, but you don't remember. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to design the teams so they have limited number of tasks to do, so they don't have to do those content switches very often. And this is essentially the concept of cognitive load. And with that, what you're trying to do is take away as many tasks from a team that they actually don't have to own and put it in some other team, and leave the team to only focus on a select number of tasks so they can move very efficiently without necessarily having to worry about constant content switches and related topics. And by the way, that's not just engineering. That's why we have specializations. That's why we have product marketeers and performance marketeers. That's why we have a different role for someone who generates leads and a different role for someone who actually delivers a sales engineering pitch. So they don't have to remember 20 different things, because they will probably forget them. And then a little bit about teams. So this is specific to product organization, engineering organization, but essentially what I think the literature says is there are 4 types of teams that make sense right now. If your team doesn't fall into one of those 4, then probably you will have some changes in the future coming. The first team is a very simple idea. A team builds a feature, or a team builds a value for someone. But essentially they have a mission that is to deliver a specific piece of value for a specific target. And that's all what they do. They shouldn't be building any infrastructure for your company. They shouldn't be solving any other problems. That should be their goal. Then you have enabling team, which is usually a very specialist team that comes when there's a change in the company. So let's say you're moving to a new cloud infrastructure. You used to be on AWS, now you're going to Microsoft Azure. Nobody knows how to use them. You create a team, they go, and they teach everyone else in the organization how to use that after they taught themselves. And then they disappear, and that's essentially enabling team. Then you have complicated subsystem team. For us, a future example, because it's in the creation process, is machine learning team. Machine learning teams generally work differently than every other team in the organization. There is a lot of failure, a lot of research that might turn out positive or might turn out negative. Very different infrastructure. They exist as a separate team. They provide specialized service to everyone else, which is machine learning. And then finally, platform team. And these are the people that essentially take away all the load from the other teams in terms of building infrastructure, and they actually carry that load. And they let other engineers focus on building new features because they are actually maintaining infrastructure, building infrastructure, and providing it as a service to everyone else. And the last, I think it's the last on this, yeah. The last topic is how you should organize those teams in terms of boundaries. So how can you organize them? For us, majority of the teams are really focused around what we call a specific job or a specific type of a problem that customer has. So, to give you an example, a problem might be, how do I create contracts? Big problem, there's a lot of issues in contract creation, and we might have a team that focuses only on talking to people who create contracts, understanding the problems that they have in the process, in the contract creation. We're talking about small and medium businesses, so what could be a problem in contract creation? Well, I don't have a lawyer, and I cannot afford a lawyer. So I'm looking for a contract template on the internet, but I actually don't know if this is a contract template that I could use. And if this contract template is a wrong contract, then all of my business will fail apart. So that's a problem, and maybe this team will build a bunch of templates for contracts and tell you where to use them. Or they will find some other problems. But essentially the teams, in our case, focus on specific problems, specific areas of product, and try to solve them that way. But there are other ways of solving this. One example is change cadence. So I used to work for a company I actually used to work for 3 companies that used to build SDKs. SDKs are the software that other engineers use to bring functionality into their own software. And we had SDKs that were on about 2 billion mobile phones in the world. So what happens when you have an SDK at 2 billion mobile phones in the world? Well, the first thing is, when something breaks, you just can't fix it. Because when you're fixing an SDK, what's going to happen is going to take you 2 weeks to release it, and then 6 months minimum to convince all of your customers to update their software with your new SDK. And that's if you're lucky. I have to say 6 months was the best we've ever done. Sometimes it took up to 1.5 years to convince everyone to update. And then they also have to release their software. So because of this change cadence, they work in a very different way. For example, their testing has to be much more thorough than for someone who does front end, where if you have a bug, you can fix it and deploy it 5 minutes later and the bug is gone. Have a bug in the SDK, it's going to be there for 1 year. That's just what it is. So you'd better have no bugs. The other thing is performance isolation. So you might have an element of the software that has to be always performant. So Leanplum sends messages, also does A/B tests, and well, today is 25th, tomorrow is going to be Black Friday. So probably on Black Friday, Leanplum is going to send, I'm guessing, 10 billion emails, maybe 15 billion emails in the world. And if those emails don't go out on time, then someone is not going to get their discount for Black Friday, and some company is not going to make, in some cases, 30% of the revenue for the year. That's a really big problem. So you have this one module that essentially has to always work. And they have to work differently than everyone else, because if emails don't get delivered, you have no customers the next day. Regulatory compliance. Is anyone familiar with Coinbase? Okay, so Coinbase is one of the largest Bitcoin and cryptocurrency exchanges in the world. They happen to be our customer before, and at Leanplum. And when they work with us, essentially every problem that we try to solve will be made 10 times harder by Coinbase because they had so many different regulations that were applied to them that, for example, we had to, like, if you think about GDPR in Europe, which is I cannot know your email address and I cannot know your private information, when it comes to Bitcoin, we literally have to obfuscate any kind of data they are sending to us, and they are sending to us all of the data. So we had to build a special team that essentially handled just the data that Coinbase sent. Team location, say less and less important in the world we are in right now, remote world, but I still get allergy to teams that are more than 6 hours apart. Good example at Vango, we had a team in London, Berlin, Beijing, Singapore, and San Francisco. And I had to do all hands twice a day. I had to be on calls at midnight, I had to be on calls at 2 a.m., I had to be on calls at 6 a.m., at 8 a.m., and essentially every day there will be a problem somewhere and I was on the call. So when you're doing, when you're hiring, think about that. It's not just the location is important, but really the time overlap is important as well. Not to mention that when we had 2 engineering teams, one actually this was Limpam in Bulgaria, the other one in San Francisco. The team in Bulgaria, for example, would go to sleep when the team in San Francisco woke up. They woke up, they said, okay, we don't know what to do because there is a release that is not finished and it seems to be blocked. What do we do? Well, we can't do anything. We're just going to sit for 8 hours, wait for them to wake up, then we're going to call them and ask what to do. And those kind of problems appear all the time. Technology, obviously I mentioned machine learning. User personas, this is another example. Not sure if you're familiar with Intercom, another big marketing company. They essentially have a persona of salesperson, customer success, marketeer, and they have different teams that build different products for each of those personas. And I would say maybe the last thing, if you're growing your company, you're probably going to change this every 6 to 12 months. Because every 6 to 12 months there will be something new you're going to learn that will tell you that what you have is not working, or your business is going to change in one way or another, so you're going to have to change it. So that's sort of the key considerations. Now let me jump to sort of my visit to all of those companies. By the way, I know you're generally not very big on asking questions, but feel free to interrupt me. I don't like to talk for an hour without being able to catch a breath. So if there is something that is actually of interest to you and you want to ask a question, just let me know. I'll repeat the question so everyone can hear, and then we will move on. So Spotify, how many people have seen this before? All right, roughly 5, 6. Well, so here's the interesting thing. When I went to Spotify, they told me the same thing. And then they told me, no, it was actually used. And no, we actually use it, but this team doesn't use it. And that team is using. And by the way, whatever you read on the blog is the best case scenario that sometimes happens, but mostly doesn't. And by the way, with most of the other companies, the same comments. So this team has a lot of advantages, but essentially there are some things from them that work and that are very used. And the first one is that they have a concept of self-sustained teams. That was something that came up in Agile, but very few people actually did it, which means you build a team not consisting of engineers of the same kind, but you build a team that is very cross-functional, so you might have front-end, back-end, mobile on a single team, so they can actually complete a product end-to-end without ever talking to another team. Talking between the teams in engineering is a big issue. The second thing is they have a long-term mission. So you don't have the situation that I've seen in some startups where you have a project, 3 months later, project finishes, you disband the team, you start a new team for another project. Huge waste of time. Their teams work for 18, 24, 36 months. They have a common problem. Working on a common problem for 24 months really allows you to be an expert. If you work on payments, you will start with knowing that there's Braintree in Stripe. 24 months later, you can build Braintree in Stripe. And that's essentially the difference for those teams. No formal leader. So this is a good example of the opposite of the Amazon model. They don't want a single person in the team that makes all the decisions. So you actually have to talk within the team and agree. And minimum dependencies again, so you don't have to talk to other teams. They actually check how often teams talk to each other. And if they talk too often, they actually figure out how to reconfigure the team so they don't have to talk very often to each other. We have a concept of a chapter, which is small family of people with similar skills. This is sort of, all the front-end engineers belong to a chapter. They meet regularly, they discuss, align. Usually the manager of those people actually is the chapter lead. And they also have a concept of a guild, more or less what the name says. It's essentially a group of people with similar interests and passion that work together to learn and introduce those passions to the company. How many people have transferred money abroad with TransferWise or Wise? No one, they just IPO'd. If you are annoyed with the fees for international transfers, these guys tend to be the best in the world for that, and that's essentially why they built a company. Their ultimate goal was to make transfers of money between different countries free. Still trying to get there, but their fees are regularly dropping, and they're always trying to find ways to make money through other means, so eventually you actually will be able to send money to your cousin abroad for birthday and don't pay a fee for that. And that's essentially their goal. They actually went crazy on the Spotify model, and they said, okay, if you're actually having a self-sustained team, then why make it only engineering and product and design? Well, if this team is growing, why don't we let them hire a recruiter? And if they are marketing their product, let them hire a marketeer. And essentially they ended up with 60 teams that are truly full stack, meaning each of them could be actually an independent startup, that have all the things that they need to do. They are organized into 7 themes around this. And as a result, they are trying to essentially move faster. Their key observation was any centralized team in the company will become a bottleneck at some point of time, because other people will be coming and asking for something, and they won't be able to get it because there's only one team, and you cannot really regulate how demand is there. So, like good example would be, whenever you're growing fast, your talent team will become a bottleneck, because suddenly every team needs to hire 3 or 5 people, and they are not prepared for that. But if each team is responsible for their own hiring, then they can hire their own HR person or talent sourcer. They can work on that and solve their problems, and they can anticipate that. And because they are responsible for that, they also cannot complain that the centralized team is not supporting them. It's actually their fault they haven't hired their own sourcer. Autonomous. This is another really crazy idea for them, which was no one can tell the team what to do. The teams do what they think is right for the company. They have a concept of coaches who come in, they look at your ideas, they'll give you some feedback. But in the end, it's your responsibility to make sure that what you're actually doing is good for the company and that you can justify it to everyone else. If you cannot justify it, people will tell you, go back and justify it, but no one will tell you, don't do it. And again, I mentioned minimize the shared areas of business. So they plan quarterly with those feedback coaches. Everyone in the company knows what everyone else is doing because they have this, I think at some point of time it was over 1,000-page long deck where essentially every team describes everything they plan to build, why, and so on. And if you're interested, you can just browse through it, get a sense of what's happening over there. And that's how they organize and align. They also have no classic managers. For them, there was generally this idea that, and I love this idea, that there is something called street credibility. And if you're curious what it means, street credibility, for them, it means when you come in the room and you ask a question, usually a bunch of heads are going to turn to some person for an answer. And that should be the manager, because everyone already looks up to them for an answer. So instead of hiring someone from outside who did an MBA and studied some things and nobody respects on the team, but they have a title, you actually choose the person that people already respect, and you solve most of the problems with that, because you don't generally have a problem of management versus subordinates, because the manager is already respected before he became a manager. So even VPs, when they join, have to work as individual contributors for at least 6 months and prove that they will be respected by others before they can actually take their VP job and be a VP in the company. And second thing is accountability. So accountability is team-based, but then you are accountable to your peers, and your peers review you. And your peers know whether you're slacking or delivering because they actually work with you every day. So that's a brilliant idea. Wish more companies use that. And to make that better, they actually have employed people whose only job is to give you feedback. To teach you how to give feedback. So feedback is painful. Nobody likes to give feedback, but nobody likes getting feedback even more, because usually it means you did something wrong. So there is entire art to giving feedback without offending the other person. And essentially what WISE is doing is they have coaches that go and teach you how to do it, so you can regularly tell your colleagues, hey, this is not really working out, without necessarily offending and burning the bridges. They also have no careers. They said careers are a distraction. We want people to come in because they want to change the world, because they want international transfers to be free. That's our mission. We will give you more money if you have high street credibility, but we don't need to change your title because titles create hierarchies. You have higher title, you're more important. You have lower title, you're less important. You look up, you look down. We don't want that. We want people to feel more or less equal, so we'll get rid of titles. I have to say, from like the people I talked to, not the most popular decision. I mean, they understood it, but then everyone has their LinkedIn, and everyone wants to get hired for the next job, for the role that they worked before. So suddenly, you were a director, and suddenly you're just a software engineer, and that says on the LinkedIn, and recruiters stop calling you for director jobs, and so that was there. But I have to say that I know at least 2 people who left because of that. And then the last thing is this weak code ownership. So essentially, you run your own services, you're on call when something goes wrong, so there is no centralized team that wakes up when your code breaks. But essentially, if you're blocked and you need to use someone else's code, you can write the code there. They still need to approve it, but there's nothing like, this is mine, this is yours. There's a bit of a, I'm responsible for maintaining this, but other people can contribute, can write to it. Okay, Valve. So I already talked a little bit about Valve. Yeah, so they have a crazy idea, the same, I guess, as stock markets, which is that smart people will figure things out, and the invisible hand of the market will help to allocate resources to the right projects. So when I went to their office, like the first thing that really was crazy for me was that everyone's desk had wheels, and people were just going with their desks from one room to another. And then they also had essentially equivalent of a tile attached to it that would essentially say which room this desk is in. And then they had a big map, which essentially said project A, project B, project C. And depending on where your desk was, that's how you communicated that you work on this project. So essentially you were on the project, let's say, they were building virtual reality glasses, you were on that project, and then in the middle of the project you thought, okay, this project's probably not going to work out. We are not as good as Oculus, let's not waste time. Okay. Well, there's no need to go into management and say, hey, this project's probably not going to work out. You just take your desk, you go and you work on another project that you think is going to work out. And eventually there's no desks in the room and the project dies, so there's like these 3 people who are still enthusiastic about it, trying to do it, and someone might tell them, hey, time to give up. But essentially, that's how they organize. As I said, there's no management. The CEO is not a CEO. I mean, supposedly, as of last year, he is a CEO now, after 20 years, but they grew to 750 people without officially anyone in charge, which kind of sounds like a crazy idea. But it worked. And why did it work? I would say that was the thing that puzzled me the most. So I've worked in 2 industries where gaming companies were my customers. And what I've learned in those industries was most of the CEOs were 28, most of the people working there were 23, and I would say as a result, the average age would be 25. Valve is a gaming company. The average age when I was there was 39. And the average person already has been in the company for 10 years. This, if you look at Silicon Valley or they're in Seattle, the average tenure of an engineer in the company is roughly 18 to 21 months. Just get too many offers, too many opportunities. The next cool startup you want to jump to, Facebook is just opening another team, so everyone is moving all the time. but people go to Valve and they stay for 10 years and they never want to leave. Well, that's essentially what they're trying to do. They hire 1 out of 100 people who applies. They run you through 5 interviews that are supposed to put you in the most uncomfortable situations that you've never dealt with. And they want to see what you're going to do, how you're going to think, how you're going to make decisions. So then if they let you make decisions, they already know that you're good at making decisions, even in situations that you actually don't know anything about. They know about your thinking process. They know how you're going to ask questions. They know who you're going to reach out to. And that essentially, for them, is maturity to make decisions is the #1 thing they hire for. And as a result, quite often, people who are mature at making decisions are a little bit older, although, of course, they have younger people, too. The other interesting thing they told me was the average person title before joining Valve was a director. I know only 2 people who joined Valve. One designed the Apple Watch interface and worked for John Ivey at Apple and took 5 steps down to join Valve. The other one was director at Netflix before joining Valve. Said, no politics, better environment, pays equally good, even though you were flat and you don't have a title, essentially better company. And so how do they actually make sure that no one is coming for a free ride? This is the most painful process I've ever seen. They actually spend 2.5 months evaluating every single person in the company. They bring everyone who's worked with you through the year in different groups and ask them to compare you to other people they've worked with. And eventually they come with a stack rank from top to bottom, from the top performer of the company into the worst performer in the company. And your salary will reflect that. So you actually have the motivation to continue delivering, and that's essentially their model. Which, by the way, 4 years ago, they were the most profitable company per employee on the planet. So it can definitely work. And then finally, Amazon, single-threaded leadership, or the one throat to choke, as they say, is yet a different model designed for a very different thing, to move fast. So to move fast, you have one decision maker. One decision maker, when they fail, you fire them, you replace them with someone else, you continue moving fast. Teams, all team members report to that person. So they make the final decision. And everyone is 100% dedicated to that team. Typical team, they like the metaphor of 2 pizzas. So their goal is essentially, and this is American pizzas, not Serbian pizzas. You know, American pizzas, they're like this. So essentially, you can feed roughly 10 people with 2 pizzas in America. So the typical team is 3 to 8 engineers plus, maybe a designer and the single-threaded owner. They have technical product managers whose essentially job is to resolve conflicts between different teams and dependencies, and they essentially are the bridges. But also, they have, of course, operationalized this idea that the teams shouldn't work too close with each other and there should be walls. So famously, I think it was Jeff Bezos who in 2001 wrote an email to all engineers that essentially said that every database has to be behind an API, and you cannot make it available to anyone else to directly read or write to your database, and if you don't get it, you'll be fired. That's also the other Amazon thing that, yeah, you follow or you get fired, but essentially the point is they are running a tight ship. The ship has to work fast. It's more of an army model than, let's say, the loose model of everyone collaborating together, quick decision making. You can build. Is it still the most valuable, or did Microsoft jump over? Well, first or second most valuable company in the planet, running contrary to what most of the other models said. So this is just to show that you can choose and you have to adapt, and not everything is perfect. Last one, Supercell. Anyone knows this company? No one played Clash of Clans or Clash Royale or, well, anyways, I spent, I think, $2,000 in their games. And apparently, they have like this segmentation of players. The ones who spend the most are called the whales. Then there are dolphins. Then there are minions, and I'm a minion with $2,000 because they're whales, spend $80,000 in a game. So I'm apparently a very poor person by their standards. But essentially, they built some of the most addictive games in the world. I think Clash of Clans alone in 1 year made $2 billion. And they are a small company. 200 people in Helsinki, 40 in San Francisco, and that's essentially it. And for them, they also wanted to build a company that moved fast, where there's a lot of autonomy, small teams, 4 to 6 people, self-managing, cross-functional. Their rules also moving in the direction of let's build an environment where people collaborate. So rule number 1, don't hire jerks. You can clearly see this is a family-like company because they never say don't hire people who don't have the right skills. A friend of mine used to run their HR in San Francisco. He said that they actually count how many times you use the word I in the interview process. When you say, what did you do at the last job? And if you say, I did this, I did that, you are not hired. If you say, we did this, we did that, you're hired. So they have a lot of different signals like that, and essentially based on that, they will try to figure out what personality you are and whether you're going to blend well with the team or not. So this was an example of a company that was extremely built towards having sort of a family-like environment, people not leaving, people not being fired. The other part is the leaders focus on communication on why and explain why you should do things, but they don't tell you what you should do. They will send you, for example, email daily with all the metrics for the company, so you have the full transparency on how things are working, but then it's your job to figure out what is the right thing to do based on the metrics that you're getting. Similarly, managers are there to provide guidance, support, make sure the teams have what they need, but not to tell them what to do. And then the last thing is, how do you align all of those teams? Well, their idea is very simple. Smart people, given the same information, will come to the same conclusions. So let's hire smart people and let's give them the same information. We don't have to manage them anymore because they will come to the same conclusions that we would have come ourselves. So the problem is solved. Doesn't work all the time, but it worked for them most of the time, and they've been pretty successful. So I've talked a little bit about the market. I'll take a break for a second, have a zip, ask if someone has a question.
So a couple of questions, you can choose which one you can reply to. What are your thoughts? You mentioned cross-functional teams in multiple times. What are your thoughts on the consensus mechanism within self-organizing teams or decision-making metrics, whatever, democracy versus some weighted system? You mentioned one of the things that goes around all of the models that you mentioned is the you build, you run it. If we are saying that a team that's building something also has to maintain that, the more they build, the more they have to maintain, so less stuff for further growth. How do we deal with that? And then you also mentioned that the function of the team defines how the organization will look, right? And in the physiology as well, we have one of the basic principles is form fits function. So who decides on the function and when to change the function?
Hold on, my short-term memory only has 3 slots, so you have to give me a time for the 4th one.
Okay.
Okay, I'll start with you build it, you run it because it's the simplest thing. I agree with your general comment that if you have to maintain it, it's going to take some cognitive load from you, and that's going to eventually slow down the team. The primary reason for you build it, you run it, is because if you build it but you don't run it, you will write a buggy software because someone else has to wake up at night when it goes down. But when you actually have to wake up yourself, you're generally going to put much more effort to make sure that the software you're building is actually resilient. So I don't think the model you build it, you run it has to be a permanent model for the company. I think if you're at Google, Ben Sloss, who's running their 6,000 people SRE team, used to be an advisor from one of my previous startups, and he always told us, you will need SRE when you have 1,000 people. And that's essentially for him was roughly the right number at which you are at the level of maturity where you can actually throw it to someone else. But also, even at Google, you build it and you run it until SREs accept it. So in order for an SRE team to take it from you, it has to be already so stable and already so resilient that they won't have to wake up to fix it. So that was number 1. Cross-functional teams, what was the question exactly?
Decision-making metrics or consensus.
Decision-making metrics, yes. So it's a good question. I could actually ask Željko how they make decisions. I'm guessing it's not by voting.
Well, it is. There other things that go into account, basically, without making an agreement in the end. So it doesn't really mean that if we voted for something, we cannot change it if there are other circumstances that come from the outside team or whatever.
Yeah, so essentially they vote. And I can tell you that if we ask the other 5 teams, they probably do it differently. The problem for me is not how you do it. The problem for me is what do you do it if you cannot agree? Because that's really a problem. Most of the time, that's not an issue. So if you cannot agree, there are essentially 2 models. One thing is you nominate someone in the room who is most knowledgeable for this particular topic, which technically is meritocracy. You just choose the most knowledgeable person and let them run. The other part is you choose someone from the organization who's outside of your team who is most knowledgeable on the topic and you ask them. Of course, there's a third model, which is you come to me, but that's not a model I like because that means I will have much, much more work than I would like to, especially as the organization scales. So it's much rather if we can find other experts in the company than if it's always one person who's somewhere on the top. Cool. 2 more questions, right?
I'll short it one. With all of these models, they sometimes correlate with success, sometimes correlate with failure. What are the mechanisms that we can see not the correlation but the causation of these models within a system? Or the same goes for technology. One problem in one technology is very hard, but it's a whole world problem in another. So how can we know if we're evolving with the help of the system or despite the system?
Yeah. Well, do you know the system? So that's essentially the starting point. Most people don't really think about the system when they are choosing the model, and that was the point of my first slide. That if you're trying to figure out the model that helps you compete, let's say in biotech, is going to be a very different model than if you're building the next ad system to compete with Google. In one case, you're going to have to move extremely fast and be extremely responsive and essentially be able to adapt to the environment. Another example would be building mobile apps. Apple changes rules usually twice a year, sometimes once a year, but they do change rules on you. Google changes their own rules, and then you have to rebuild your app. And then you have to change it, and then you have to remove some things, and then you have to figure out how you can go around those rules because, well, they're essential to your business model. So if you're in an environment where the change is often applied to you from outside, you're going to build a different model. If you're building software for HR, this is a slow-moving market. Sale can take 9 months. You're working in a different situation. You are in a situation like we were at Leanplum, and you have a couple of customers like Tinder, Coinbase, GrabTaxi that pay you $3 to $5 million a year. You have to get used to the fact that they will come one day and say, I need this change, and I need this change by the end of the month, or I'm not going to renew the contract. So you have to build a completely different type of a team that actually can be responsive to this change and can tackle those situations without disrupting the rest of the organization. So essentially the point is, the choice of the model should be after you understood where you're competing and essentially what you're trying to adapt for.
Thanks.
And by the way, great example, not sure, have anyone over here read the book called Team of Teams? It's from General McChrystal, who used to run the Joint Task Force for the US in Iraq, essentially back in the 2004 to 2010. They tried to capture Al-Qaeda in Iraq, they tried to capture the terrorists, but every time they actually went to a house and they extracted some information, they would then take that information, send it over to Washington, where a bunch of analysts would analyze that information, then they would come back a week later and tell them, hey, actually, you know, Osama bin Laden was next door a week ago. So good luck. And they've done it for 2 or 3 years, and then they realized that this whole command system where, you know, all the people with guns report to one person and all the analysts report to another person, and every sort of communication between them has to go through the top is non-functional. So US Army did a crazy thing. They actually built cross-functional teams. And they sent them together, and they also said, make decisions on your own. Don't ask the general to make a decision, because if your analyst has information and you should act on about it now, if you have to wait for someone who's sleeping in Washington to give you a green light, it's going to be too late. They solved the problem. He left. The army went back to what they used to do before, and they completely dismantled the model. Even though it worked really well for them, but the next guy didn't really feel it. So that's the other problem, right? It's also sometimes what the leader likes. And that, I would say, is the biggest problem, that quite often the choice of a model is not driven by the problem, but is driven by what your CEO or whoever else is familiar with. And that's the most scary part. Because that means they bring the same model from a business to business, it doesn't apply, but they still try to use it and they wonder why it's not working.
You mentioned army models. What are your thoughts on the extreme ownership in cross-functional teams? If you read it.
Well, I love the book. I think it's a very interesting book. I would say, in general, my thought is very simple. I use the extreme ownership as a metaphor, right? There are two ways of thinking about the word. One way is things affect me, and that's how my life plays out. The other way is I'm in control and I can make a change, right? One thing is to say, why you didn't get promoted? Well, my boss doesn't like me. The other way is, why you didn't get promoted? Well, I didn't invest any time for my boss to get to know me, right? These are the two very simple changes. It's actually the same answer, but one puts you in control, the other makes you a victim. So generally, if you're trying to build teams that have autonomy and you want to give them freedom to make their own decision, it's very hard to do that if that team consists mostly of people who have this victim mentality of other things defining whether they can achieve something or not. You definitely want the people who are driving the team to be the people who feel like, I can make a change. And that's, I would say that's my entire thought. Maybe the book is a great book and I do recommend reading, but I would say that would be my sort of main take from the book.
Thanks.
Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink.
No questions.
Since I'm in a startup, how do you know when to scale from a startup to like a scale up? Because there are a lot of things that can go wrong if you scale prematurely.
It's actually a great point. But most startups that I know that failed scaled too fast. But I do know a couple that scaled too slow. Uber did not invent taking you from point A to point B. There was actually one other startup in San Francisco 2 years earlier. They didn't scale fast enough. Uber outscaled them. But in most other cases, actually, companies run out of business because they try to scale too fast. The question is, how do you know that you actually have a product that people want to pay for? That's really the big question. And then, how many of the people who already paid up for your product exist in the world? That's the second question, right? Because if you sell a product to, let's say you sell $1 million of product, and everyone loves it, everyone is using it. I know a lot of VCs who would say 1 million ARR is actually the point at which I believe there is a product market fit. And I can tell you that's complete bullshit, because I was in a company that had $1 million ARR, and that $4 million ARR had to pivot because they realized that the global market for their product was 4 million ARR. So it very much depends on those two factors, right? How much money you're already making, and whether there's enough people out there that you can reach in a reasonable way to sell them the same product. That's a good sign to scale. And that gets you to about 10, 15. And then there is a second question, which is, can you scale at a much more efficient way so you can take it from 15 to 100 million faster, with more learnings, with better margins and so on. Because that's the other part, right? If you work with VCs, seed, Series A, product market fit, Series B, love, growth, Series C, show me your margins. Series D, show me your margins and growth, I don't want to see anything else. You didn't grow 50%, you don't have 80% gross margin, I'm going to give you money. So you also have to think, can you hit the next milestone? And is your product ready to hit the next milestone?
Thanks.
All right, any other questions? All right.
Is there something that we can take away, like that all these models have, and take it like success advice, or there is nothing like shared between?
I think there are certain things that are shared. Now, correlation, causation, also startup world is a world of people copying each other, whether it makes sense or not. So sometimes you have very popular model and they don't work for 80% of the people, but it's like with the Spotify model that Alex mentioned that it didn't work for Spotify. But everyone tried to copy it. They didn't even realize that actually there were a lot of issues in that model. And that's essentially, I would say, what makes it difficult. But I think cross-functional teams, that's kind of fairly standard. Honestly, I don't know if there's anything else that is really standardized right now, because like I think everyone has OKRs now, or almost everyone has OKRs, although I was just told today that there's a wave on Twitter of people who say OKRs suck and we should get rid of them. So even that is not given anymore.
Thanks.
All right, so a little bit for us. So how you think about model, you think about the principles that you want to have in your industry, where you're going and what you're doing. So I'm going to start with the first thing. I have to admit, I think PDFs suck. I think it's a terrible technology. I hope it dies soon. And I hope we will kill them, by the way, because if someone else kills them, then it also kills our business. But PDFs are technology that was really developed in 1992. It hasn't really much evolved since then. Has anyone tried to read a PDF on their mobile phone? You tried? Yeah? You kind of scroll to the right, scroll to the bottom. It doesn't really shrink. It's too small and too big. And then you try to fill a PDF. Someone sends you actually a form to fill on your mobile phone. And it will take you 6 hours because it's such a horrible experience. Because PDFs were essentially built to look great on paper. Who's bought a printer this year? Yeah, that's more or less how the rest of the world also answers to this question. So you have a product that was built for printers, except that nobody buys printers, so then you're like, okay, what do we do with this product? But it's also a product that governments love and approve the signatures in it, and everyone is used to it, and you can file your taxes in it, and so on. So you have this whole inertia of a word that is adopted to a standard that essentially has outgrown itself.
That's why we use QWERTY keyboards as well.
Yeah, great example. But hopefully PDF will disappear. I have no hope that QWERTYs will disappear. But essentially, what does it mean? Well, for us, it means we have a business that we have to disrupt ourselves. So we need to be agile, we need to be responsive, we need to be able to introduce change and very quickly roll out those changes. So that was one thing in our design. The second thing is we want to scale fast, and we want to hire smart people so they can make decisions, because that actually allows you to be efficient and fast. If every time our PM who wants to make a decision needs to run to me, then I'm going to be the bottleneck for the entire organization. So I'd rather hire a very smart PM and let him make that decision, and that's essentially what scales very nicely. I stole from Supercell the alignment through shared context. We share as much information as we can. We'll share more. We put a lot of effort into thinking, how can we make data available for you? Well, we want to democratize data. We don't want data to be analyzed by analysts. So we're investing in things like Looker to essentially make life and access to data easy for everyone, so you know everything that happens in the company, so you're never in a situation where, like yesterday, because we haven't democratized data yet, I've learned some things about our business model that I didn't know, and I think in the team over here as well, which essentially was that on our mobile app, we have much more restrictions for usage in developing markets than we have on our web app. Most of the company didn't know that. Now we have to fix it. And that essentially is the problem of lack of shared contexts. Teams over individuals, that's very clear. Attachment principles, sports team, not family. We love each other, but I always say that families have one problem. You can have this drunk uncle that comes and destroys you every Christmas, and you can't fire that uncle. But we'll definitely fire that uncle if he shows up to our company. And the point is, you want to build a company where you like each other, but you also have to have the sense that your job over here is not guaranteed. You're still a player on a team, and you have to be helping this team. So what can we offer? Well, the big problem for us, for example, is that our headquarters are in Zurich. Well, it also happens that Google's largest office in Europe is in Zurich. So they like to hire the same engineers that we like to hire. And ETH is a great school for virtual reality and AR, so Facebook now opened a big office in Zurich, and they are trying to hire a lot of engineers that we want to hire. So what can we offer that Google and Facebook cannot offer? Well, we can give you impact. You can actually work on something big And on Google, you're going to work on one button, probably for 4 years. We can offer you a personal growth. You can be promoted 4 times a year if you grow that fast. At Google, try to be promoted more than once every 3 years, and people will look at you and think you're crazy. Hey, come on, wait your turn. Right? For us, like, if you grow, that's great. That's great for the company. I'll pay you more every single time you learn new skills because we all benefit from it. And with personal growth, also, there can be career growth. That follows with that. Company grows fast, you can move up and up and up. And what do we recruit for? Let's say the first thing I'll admit, we recruit is skills for the job. If you look at our interviews, we have only 1 cultural interview, 3 interviews that are essentially skills for the job, and 1 is kind of like a hiring manager or something else, which is partially skills for the job too. But we do test for one thing, which is growth focus. And essentially what growth focus means for us is A, that you're willing to take risks, B, that you're okay to make mistakes, and C, that you're okay to admit that you made the mistakes because otherwise you cannot learn from them. So, and I'll explain that a little bit later. We actually, when we do, for example, checks with teams, we ask, what did you learn in the last month? We don't ask, what did you ship in the last month? Because maybe what you shipped actually didn't work. But if you didn't learn from what you shipped last month, then we have a problem. If you've learned, you're going to ship something better next month. That's okay. It's going to come there. Continuous learning, team orientation. I don't count I and we's, but if there is someone who really sounds odd with a lot of I's, probably will not hire them. And then maturity to take decisions. I would say for us, it's much less involved. It's more a focus on no one knows everything. What happens when you don't know something? Are you willing to ask questions? Or were you going to make a lot of assumptions and you're going to pretend that you know something? So I'll sometimes throw a question that I know a candidate will not have an answer for in an interview just to see whether they'll actually say, I don't know this. I actually didn't even think I should know this because I'm interviewing for a different job. Or they will start bullshitting. Like, okay, you're probably not a good fit. So this is really, the high-level principles. And I'll tell a little bit about how we think about the organization. Simple first concept, still in development for us. But we like to think about a team starting from the top to the bottom as first we have a domain. I'll talk a little bit about domains more. But it's a group of teams that essentially try to solve a common problem together. And they are trying to build a mission for themselves that can last 12 months, but most likely is going to take 2 to 3 years to solve. A good mission could be, for example, well, how many of you use Google Drive? Or any other folder like work? How many documents are in your Google Drive? Well, I would say there is a common thing. If you have more than 50 documents in Google Drive, that means once you put the document there, probably no one else will open it after 1 month. It essentially disappears, it becomes a black hole. Why? Because Google Drive is not organized. Well, I mean, you can create folders, but I don't know anyone who creates folders anymore. Everyone has tags, auto-tagging, smart search, everything else. For some reason, Google has all these features, but they haven't applied to their own document management. So if you go to an organization that have 1,000 documents, and you have a question, for example, what are the documents that my team wrote in the last 3 months? You have actually no way of finding it, unless you're going to go through every single document and check every single author, and then organize them yourself and group them, and it's going to take you probably a week. Simple thing could be solved in a minute. So let's say a problem, document management. We want to help you organize all of your documents. A team can have a mission for 2-3 years like that. They will start by adding tags. Then they maybe will build something in machine learning to auto-tag the documents. Then maybe they will introduce some other concept like smart search, leverage natural language processing to figure out the contents of the document. So instead of writing, show me all the contracts with the date like this, you can write, show me all the contracts that expire in the next 2 months. And with natural language processing, we can actually analyze the text and surface those contracts. So a team will have a mission, let's say for 36 months, or a group of teams, domain. Then they will have a bunch of initiatives to work on. For example, let's create the tags. Let's create the auto-tagging. then they will have a bunch of features with them. Okay, so what is a feature in this particular case? Well, I want to add a tag, I want to remove a tag, I want to change a tag. And then there will be a user story that is the smallest element of it. But essentially everything should start from top to bottom. And I'm saying we are in the process because we are still working on some kinks of those long-term missions. And we are trying to figure out at the same time as we are working on the long-term mission, what should we be building next? So we're in the process of starting from the end and also starting from the beginning and trying to figure out how to get there. But that's essentially the model we are trying to introduce. We use OKRs, so everyone who hates OKRs, I'm fine with that. We like OKRs. Why I like OKRs is because they happen every quarter, which forces you to break your big projects into quarters, which essentially means that you're never in this 9 months, never-ending thing that will continue longer and longer and longer because you haven't really thought about how you can break into smaller pieces. It creates cadence, it creates rituals, teams move together. We work in bi-weekly sprint cycles. I'm not going to talk about the 3 things on the top because they should be familiar to anyone who worked in engineering, retrospectives, backlog refinements, planning. But we have 3 types of meetings. 2 happens every week, 1 happens every month that people find generally interesting. The first meeting I found really bizarre when I joined. It's called Silent OKRs. It's a really, really bizarre experience because you join on the call, and there might be 70, 80, 90 people on the call. And then CEO talks for like 2-3 minutes. We'll do some major announcement. And then we all start reading. And there's like a video, and there's a bunch of people reading their screen on the video. And they read for 20 minutes. And then there's a break, and we read for another 20 minutes. And what are they reading? Well, every team writes their update of what happened on that team a week before, what's happening with their product, what's happening with their metrics. And essentially, this is an opportunity for us to create a time in the day for you to get familiar with what other teams are doing. Because the beauty of the TransferWise 1,500 long set of slides about what every team is doing is that it's there, but most people don't read it. And why do they don't read it? Because they have to focus on their own team and they have to solve their own problems. So everyone knows it's there and it's interesting, but eventually, most people don't read it because they don't have time. So we essentially force you to have time to stay up to date with what every other team is doing, and this is an opportunity to do that. Demo launches, I think most people are familiar with it, but essentially what happens is you come to the office or you stay at home, you get yourself some nice food, you eat your lunch, and different teams present what they've built in the last week so you can get familiar with new products that we are releasing and the new things. And then finally, monthly OKR check-ins. This is essentially where you come to us to tell us what you've learned last month. That's really the biggest part of the meeting. And then we ask you some questions, we give you some tips, you tell us, okay, you know, what we've learned last month is that we can't really operate like this unless we get a second designer. So then I run to HR and we try to hire a second designer, so it's also about unblocking you. But really what we are trying to do with this meeting is not to have a status check on we finished this project, we shipped this, we didn't ship that. I already know that from the silent OKRs. This is supposed to be a conversation where we are trying to see whether the team is learning more about the problems they're trying to solve, whether they are moving in the right direction, and also to see the progress even if things don't work out, because things naturally don't work out. I don't know if you know, but statistics in engineering is that 70% of features that are shipped are never or rarely used by anyone. So by definition, 2/3 of our time we produce crap that nobody wants to use. If you add to that A/B tests that actually prove to you that it doesn't work even ahead of releasing, you'll probably find out that 20% of your features actually that you started working on eventually end up in someone else's hands. So doing status reports sometimes can be really depressing. This didn't work, this didn't work, this didn't work, we suck. Well, instead of that, we ask, what did you learn from this experiment? What did you learn from this? What are you going to do next? And that's a much more interesting conversation to have for us, for the team, and we can actually help there. Status report doesn't really help anyone. Okay, the second thing. So this is, I think I talked a lot about this, but this is from the CEO and founder of Netflix. In a fast and innovative company, ownership of critical big-ticket decisions should be dispersed across the workforce at all different levels, not allocated according to hierarchical status. Another big thing for us, I prefer to make as few decisions as possible. I think PMs in the team are much better suited to make decisions about what the team should build. I think hiring managers are much better suited to make decisions about who should they hire to their team than I am, and so on and so on and so on. So the point is not about, starting to believe, and I've seen some managers who actually do believe that they are smarter than others, so they should be making decisions. You're generally not. You're just kidding yourself, especially if you're hiring well. So let people make decisions, because this will be much faster. And you're also not going to have this situation where they have to go and ask for permission every single time they are trying to do something. So our team, as I said, the only thing that I think everyone agrees on is that you should have cross-functional teams. The only thing is that we cannot agree is we don't call them teams, we call them pods. That's to avoid the confusion with actual teams that are not cross-functional. So our cross-functional teams are called pods. They are 6 to 10 people. They have a PM, they have engineering pod lead, 4 to 7 engineers, UX designer, data scientists. We didn't go the crazy TransferWise route of hiring HR people, simply because that's the level of inefficiency and responsiveness that they think is too much for our industry. It was good for their industry. For our industry, it's probably not required yet, although who knows? If hiring doesn't pick up very fast, we might actually go that way as well. So they are autonomous. They take decisions on their own. They have a long-term mission. They focus on the outcomes, so we don't really talk about the features that you ship. We focus about specific metrics that you have and whether they are moving forward in the right direction or not. Good example, contract management team is interested in how many people put digital signature on the contract. That's their North Star metric. The more signatures they get every month, that means they have more people who are happy, who are using the product. So they essentially organize everything to get more signatures every month. They build features to get more signatures every month. And that's essentially how they measure their progress. Are they getting more features? They don't need me to tell them whether they're progressing. They know it just by looking at their metrics. Team level accountability for deliverables. And we have the Facebook model. So we sometimes do have gridlocks, but generally people come to agreements. And the reason why we want to have this model is very simple. When PM is the only person making decisions, your business will be prioritized, but your technology will deteriorate, and one day you're going to have to rewrite everything, or you're going to be stuck with a lot of refactors. It's a very famous story I've heard from the current CTO of Microsoft, previous CTO of LinkedIn. When LinkedIn IPO'd, they essentially shut down for 9 months, and they rewrote the entire software from beginning to end, because it was in such a bad state, because they were pushing with features so much. Well, lucky for LinkedIn, they don't really have competitors. But if you have 5 competitors and you're shutting down for 9 months, and I've seen that too, that project was called MySpace. And weirdly enough, when they shut down to rewrite to MySpace 3.0, Facebook happened. And by the time they finished rewriting, MySpace didn't exist. So those kind of things can really destroy you. And then, so PM represents the business, pod lead represents the technology, designer, UX researcher, they represent the customer, and if there's a data scientist, they essentially act like a chief data officer. And essentially the whole idea is to think of this as a mini startup that is ready to make decisions on their own. When possible, co-located. Hiring and team membership is primarily driven by the team. So if the team feels like someone should join, they join. If the team has a problem, they should escalate it. Loosely coupled, so you should be able to contribute to other code bases. No one will prevent you from that. You build it, you run it. Although I would say we don't have an on-call yet that wakes up people at night when something goes down. That's something that still needs to come. But you definitely have responsibility. And maybe the last thing on hiring, I already talked about it, but the model that we like is a model where for every junior person you have at least one very, very senior person in a team. The reason for that is junior people consume a lot of time. They need coaching, they need corrections, they need growth, they need help from other people. They sometimes don't know what they should be focusing on. So you don't want to have a team that is mostly juniors or half of them are juniors. What you want is you want to have balance, and preferably majority of the people for us will be at the level of senior/staff engineer, and then a few more junior and a few more senior. That's the model we are aspiring to go to. Mentioned a little bit about domains. There's kind of a group of teams. I think our team doesn't know is that we have a limit, and we don't want that to go over 50 people. The reason why we don't want domains to go over 50 people is because there's this concept in psychology that comes from a guy called Dunbar that essentially evaluated how well our brain can maintain information about other people. And there's a bunch of different numbers. The most famous is the number 150, which essentially says that you can roughly know 150 people. Of course, you know more than 150 people, but at any point of time, you actually can stay in touch with 150 people. Other people will be disappearing from your memory. They essentially will become far acquaintances. 50 people is the number of people we can know relatively well. This is the maximum of what we would consider loose friends. Not close friends, that number is 15, but loose friends is roughly 50. So essentially, I would say what happens at 150 is the 151st person we meet, we generally don't have empathy for. So a crazy thing that happens in startups, once they start crossing 150 people, a lot of politics start to happen. And a lot of silos starts getting developed. And a lot of mentality of us versus them, because we are tribal and our tribes have to be smaller than 150 people, so we start thinking in our tribal terms about the other people. 50 people is where we can actually have close, friendly relationship. So that's what we want to keep the main to, because these teams have to work closely together, they have to collaborate, so that's a good number to essentially maintain so people still can like each other. So this is how we are right now. As you can see, a lot of empty boxes, but essentially these are our domains. So we already start our organization with domains in mind, so the architecture will represent it, so we can hire people according to that. And this is where we hope to be in the next 6 months. So that's a lot of growth and a lot of hiring, sort of filling those boxes. But essentially, the goal for us is to build enough teams that solve specific customer problems so we can move in parallel because there's a lot of problems to solve. But we also want those teams to work closely together. So for example, we have a group of teams that is focused on building the next generation document editor that hopefully one day will replace PDFs. A group of teams that are focused on growth. Two teams focused on the contract management. And also 2 teams for us, platform, tools, and productivity, whose job is to essentially build internal tools so engineers have to spend less time thinking about infrastructure, about problems, and so on, and they can make everyone much more productive. Okay. I will pause here for a second and ask if there are any questions. All right, here we go. I think we have a mic over here.
HR question. Like, how does your team decide who to hire? What does that mean?
Well, so we have agreed process, and we have agreed roles in the interview process, like most companies would have. The question is, how do you organize this process? And essentially for us, the concept in this process is it has to be a mix of the team and impartial people from the company to solve certain problems. So, for example, our HR, which we call people and culture, have always one interview of every single person. And they have a veto if they believe someone is not a cultural fit. But then most of the other interviews are generally with the team, with the exception of we like to have one person who is from outside of the team who comes and interviews to essentially say, this team is not lowering standards. So this is a concept of a bar setter, which we are still working and refining. We stole it from Amazon. But essentially is the concept of people who are trained in particular interviews. And for example, we have a person who is a product manager who is involved in most of the hires. And he comes in and says, well, this person for us is really at level 3.3. Or we actually don't have 3.3, 3.2 or 4.1. And then the rest of the team discusses whether they agree, disagree. And I would say generally in most of this, if someone has a strong no, we will not hire a person. Also, maybe one extra thing, whenever we hire managers, it's an informal rule, but essentially always applied. That person has to interview with the team, and we would never hire a manager if the team doesn't like the manager. That's probably the most important thing with hiring a manager, right? You want to hire someone that the team actually say, well, I can learn from this person, I think they inspired me, I think I will feel comfortable working with them. Other than that, a lot of work in progress. We have some questions defined, as with every startup, some more mature, some less mature, and essentially continue evolving it. Great, any other questions? All right, I'll jump into this. So we also have concept of guilds, which are meritocracy oriented. These are essentially people who, for example, work all on the front end. And they need to agree on the standards for front end. Or these are all PMs who have to agree on the standards for how we validate products. So it's meritocracy oriented, meaning we choose from our group someone who we want to be the guild master. There is no one who actually people report to. They set the bar, they align the different teams around this, and they also usually are the most senior person, so they provide their expertise to other people in the guild on, technology, blueprints, how to become master in their own craft, and so on. So, example, as I mentioned, we have this vertical pod with product manager, data scientist, designer, pod lead, engineers, and then everyone in the pod belongs to some guild, with the exception of the mobile team, because all the mobile engineers are in the same team, so we didn't have a need to create a separate guild. They can talk to each other. But when we have mobile engineers in other teams, there will be also a mobile guild. Okay, I think one of my last topics, very important to my heart. Tell me how you will measure me, and I'll tell you how I'll behave. One of the famous quotes, and it's actually true. Tell people how you're going to measure them, they will start very quickly optimizing their behavior so they look good on the scores. Or like me, they will spend $2,000 in the game to essentially get that score up. But either way, we like to have high scores on whatever we are being measured. So for us, we are in the process of building essentially three separate sets of metrics. The first set of metrics I'll call the business metrics, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. These are essentially the metrics that help us understand whether our business is working well and whether our customers are happy. The second set of metrics that our head of engineering, Niklas, is working on is essentially technical metrics. And these are the metrics that help us see whether our platform is actually in good health. And that's one of the big topics I mentioned. I've seen a lot of rewrites. I've also been in 3 different rewrites, joining different companies to essentially spend a year just rewriting the entire stack. Do not recommend. It's a really horrible experience, and it's a really boring experience, and it's really demotivating to everyone. So what you're trying to do is you essentially, like with medicine, you try to keep yourself healthy. Right? Instead of having a heart attack and then going through recovery or having other problems, you try to essentially keep everything in a good state, and that's what the technical metrics are for. And then finally, the teams can look at their own productivity metrics. We make a point of not asking for teams' productivity. It's really more recommended for teams to have it and measure so they can see how well they are doing, whether they are improving, whether there are slowdowns, whether having too much to maintain in terms of software is actually slowing them down. So then maybe we need to move some of that to another team. But the reason why we don't want to measure it is because it creates this weird game where people try to be more productive and they essentially start burning out at some point of time. This is not about trying to see how much we can squeeze out of the people or how many things they can ship in a particular day. So this is a metric that teams should have, but no one really checks whether they do. But every time I meet with them, I do recommend that they start having them. Okay, so I talked a little bit about business metrics. So this is what we are essentially having with different teams. So each team will have 1 or 2 metrics. In one case, we have 3 metrics that essentially are top-line metrics that describe how well their team is doing. So for someone who works on document editing, they might have a metric, for example, number of documents edited in the month, and let's say number of users who came to edit documents with us in a month. Then they will have a line of metrics underneath. So What drives the number of documents in a month? Well, probably the number of sessions, number of documents per session, number of uploaded documents in a particular period of time, so they can look at all of those metrics as leading indicators of their overall success. And then below that, they might have metrics that you cannot build as an equation, but they still have a relationship. So a good example would be something like Net Promoter Score or Customer Effort Score. How does that relate to the number of documents? Well, there is no direct relationship. When NPS goes up by 1 point, we don't have a number of metrics going by 1 point, but we know that when NPS drops, the customers leave. So we can build that relationship either by using regressions or by looking over time how different behaviors, essentially, how different NPS scores correlate with different metrics and understand how they affect our business. And the goal for us is to essentially have a good view of the entire business so everyone can see when there are problems, everyone can identify easily the areas that we need to fix and things that we need to move. Yeah, and the last quote from me, again, Reed Hastings. I already talked about context, not control, but I would say the other part of this sentence is very important. Don't seek to please your boss. I think one of the biggest problems I've seen in companies is essentially a relationship where people need to impress their boss in order to get promoted, in order to get rewarded, in order to have a job. The moment that happens, I cannot be honest with my boss. I cannot tell my boss when he's doing something stupid. I just should let him do something stupid, because if I tell him he's doing something stupid, he might fire me. And at that point of time, you're essentially blind. So the first thing that you have to build is the culture of trust, where someone can actually come to you and say, well, what you're doing is really stupid, let's just not do it, let's move on. And what we are trying to do is, and I'll cover this in two sort of slides, is essentially create an environment where we have this growth, I talked about it, but where we also have a situation where people don't necessarily see their boss as someone who is superior in any shape and form. So the first thing I would say is we have dual career ladders. I'm sure everyone is already familiar with the fact that most engineers in many companies can go up the ladder without becoming managers. We took it to a more extreme point, so you can be a director level designer, you can be a director level product manager, and so on, without managing any people. Essentially the goal is we want you to have positive impact on the company, and if you want to manage people, that should be your calling. You shouldn't be moving to become a manager because it pays more. It actually might pay less. We actually had one candidate who applied for a role of a manager. It was, I think, 3 months ago. And we interviewed that candidate, and we determined that actually he's more experienced as a technical employee than as a manager. And we created 2 offers, one with a higher salary for the individual contributor role, and one with a lower salary as a manager. Called him, I explained the situation, I said, you can choose. If you want to grow as a manager and that's your passion, that's great, but you're going to make a little bit less money, because based on our skill criteria, you're a less experienced manager than you are on the technical field. He actually chose to be a manager, he's now our head of data. But those kind of situations are interesting, and this is what we try to have in conversations with employees around performance reviews. It's like, if you want to be a manager, but that's a different job. It's different requirements. Do you really like spending time with people? Do you like solving their problems? Do you like dealing with dramas? Do you like coaching also, the positive things? Yes, be a manager. But if you love technology and you love building software, don't become manager for the money, because we will not pay you more. It's as simple as that. Continue learning technology, and you're going to make more money that way. And that's essentially the choice we want to create. Is also, the reporting structure is not reflective of seniority. So you could be a manager level 4, managing an individual contributor level 5. And that's okay. I often hear great managers hire people better than themselves. I'm saying, how can you hire people better than themselves if you cannot pay them better than yourself? That's kind of weird. Why do they have to take a big pay cut to work for you if they're better than you? So you can actually pay them more than you're making. If you can swallow your pride, and hopefully everyone can, And then you can hire great people, and they'll be making more money than you do, but that will be great for your team. And then a little bit about the review process. Extremely tiring. We are literally finishing it this week. So a lot of exhausted managers in the company. But how we do this process is we collect comprehensive feedback from peers, from the manager, from direct reports. The reason for that is to eliminate the concept in Agile called silent gun. Essentially, silent gun means I can kill your career, so as your manager, so you should be afraid of challenging me ever. So we try to eliminate that by essentially eliminating the possibility that the manager can kill anyone's career. I think today we were doing calibrations, and if I remember correctly, we finished with 3 or 4 people who actually got promoted higher than their manager suggested. Managers kind of, I think, were a little bit surprised when they came in and said, I think this is like 3.2. They were expecting the management to say, no, this is not that high. We don't want to pay that much money. And instead, we said, well, no, actually, we've heard that this person also did this, this, and this. And that looks more like a 1 level higher. Why don't we go 1 level higher for this person? After all, we want to reward people for growing, for delivering value. So in our case, it's not really something where we want to, let's say, minimize the spend. What we want to do is we want to create an environment where everyone feels they can go up. And for that, to do that, we essentially have situations where maybe individual contributor will make more money than their manager at the end of the process, simply because of how we reward them. We essentially have a framework. This is maybe more relevant for HR, how we evaluate people. So we have one concept, which is skills for the role. This is engineering skills for a specific role and so on. But then we have 6 other categories that we evaluate on equal terms. One of them is how well you communicate with others. And this is not just for managers. If you are an engineer and you're going in seniority, you need to communicate well because you're going to influence a lot of people with your decisions. Your leadership. Are you actually leading people? Are you actually involved in the decision of where the company is going? We said that we want everyone to be part of the decision on the OKRs. If you're actually not involved in the OKR process for your team, if you are not telling the manager we should be doing this, then maybe you shouldn't be promoted. Because we want actually people who bring ideas and who are willing to challenge others. Ownership, I think that's clear. We talked about extreme ownership, very much related with us. Do you actually own what you do? Do you feel in control? Do you take it forward? Growth, this is more, I think, both sides. Not only are you growing, but are you also helping others grow? And big part of it is actually, are you giving regular feedback? Are you receiving feedback? How are you reacting to this feedback? Is this feedback that you're acting on, or is this feedback that you're offended and doing a bit of drama that you got it? All of those things go into evaluation. And then finally, the last 2, focus. Are you focused on the most important things? Are you prioritizing well? Are you thinking about where to use your time? And teamwork. Are you a good teammate? Simple as that. We calibrate this across the company. So essentially, what happens is first the group meets the peers and the managers, and together they agree on the level. Then they come to the second group, which is usually management team, plus people and culture, and we look together at whether the criteria are applied the same way across every team. Because sometimes what happens is one person thinks particular behavior is level 3, another person thinks particular behavior is level 4. And then we have to tell the person level 3 to move it to level 4, or vice versa. So we essentially try to create that. So it's not really about our perceptions about the person, although if I heard something that is not reflected, I will ask, for example, did they do this? Did that change your opinion? But essentially the goal is to apply the same criteria across the entire company, so we don't have situations where it's easier to get promoted in marketing than it is in engineering or anything like that. And then finally, I would say, I think the 2 things, and the last thing we were literally explaining yesterday. First of all, promotions can happen off schedule. So if you're really growing fast, if you're really learning fast, why would you need to wait 6 months? It can happen earlier, and it does happen earlier. And the second thing is, what do you do with managers if the higher level position is not available? So let's say you're a manager of a team, and the next promotion essentially would be to manage managers of the teams. Well, we still promote you. And then you're going to wait for that position to open, but we don't feel like you shouldn't be paid more because you already have the skills and you're delivering them for the company. Next position will be yours. But until then, the only thing we can do to make it fair is to essentially pay you like you're already in that position. So maybe a bit crazy, but we figured that this is something that we can do that is unique, that we can offer to people that, for example, Google doesn't offer, and obviously that's a good way for us. Plus, we are in the knowledge industry. If you learn, you become better. The company is better. So this is the best thing that we can reward, your personal growth. And that's all from me. Thank you so much. Thank you for bearing with me. Wow, I've talked a lot. Right, any last questions? Well, if not, then I think we have some beers and some other amazing snacks in the back, and I'll be there, and you can ask me any questions directly there. And thank you so much for your time.